Hi everybody, welcome to Activity 6.3. In this video, I want to quickly review with you the concept of plot, which you can see here on the screen I describe as like the engine of a story. But what really does that mean? Let's talk about it. So, plot is an element of literature. It's something that exists in almost every single fiction story. And the way that I define it here on the screen is it's the sequence of events of a story. But I like to compare it sort of to like an engine that pushes the story forward. It's the action of a story, the thing that drives the story forward and makes you want to keep watching or makes you want to keep reading. That's plot. So let's take a look at what plot really looks like in a story. You've probably seen this diagram before. This is a way that when we study literature, we try and visually represent the shape of a story's plot. And there are 5 parts to this diagram. So let's talk about each of the 5 really quick. The first part of any plot is the exposition. Now, exposition is just a fancy way of saying introduction or beginning. The most famous exposition of all is, of course, Once Upon a Time. But there are lots of different ways that authors choose to introduce their stories. Now, no matter how they introduce their story, though, a good exposition is going to do 3 things. First, a good exposition will introduce the main characters of the story. The second thing that happens is that the setting of the story is established. And when we say setting, what we mean is where is this story taking place and when is it taking place? And a third thing that's really important, which is to establish the conflict of the story. Now that is super important. In fact, let's go back to a plot diagram. You see an arrow pointing to a spot on the plot diagram, right when the flat line starts to go up. And that is because the third part of an exposition that gets its own little spot on the diagram is called conflict. Conflict is really important in a story. You can't really have a story without some form of conflict. Often we think of conflict as a bad thing, but in the case of literature, conflict is really what motivates the characters to act and what makes the action of the story happen. Without conflict, you just have a flat line. Another way that I like to define conflict is that it's the main problem of the story. Now, conflict can take 2 main forms. The first kind of conflict that you'll often see is called internal conflict. That's conflict that's happening inside of a character, in their heart or in their mind. And a lot of times people who study literature, they call that person versus self conflict. Here's an example of that. Take a look at this guy. He's staring at that dessert, and you can tell he's trying not to look at it. He doesn't want to give into the temptation to eat it. But inside of his mind, there's 2 voices. One is saying like, oh, you should eat that dessert. Take a bite of it right now. It looks so good. And another side of him is like, no, I shouldn't do that. I should wait for, it looks like he's waiting for somebody, right? And he's like sort of being pulled between these 2 things. That's an example of internal conflict. Now, usually internal conflict in literature is a little more serious, right? Like a character just struggling with, should I go on? Should I give up hope? Should I persevere, right? Those are examples of internal conflict. Another kind of common conflict that you'll see is external. And this can be several different types. You can have a character versus others. So, 2 characters fighting or a group of characters fighting. Or it can be a character versus other forces that aren't really characters, like a character versus nature, so trying to survive, for example. So, for example, you've got Napoleon Dynamite, right? And he and his brother are fighting. That would be character versus character. And that's a silly example, but in A Long Walk to Water, right, you have the Nuer and the Dinka fighting, or the SPLA fighting the North Sudanese. And so external conflict can be very real, right? And then you can also have person versus nature, right? Which would be like, think about Bear Grylls, right? Eating bugs to survive. But he's not really fighting against another person. He's like fighting against this impersonal force, and he's fighting for survival. That's another type of conflict. All right, let's go back to the plot diagram. So, as I said, when that conflict gets established at the end of the exposition, it starts to drive the action. And the reason the line is starting to go up like that is because the story starts to get a little bit more exciting. The action starts to rise. And so then the story moves into the next part of the plot, which is called the rising action. And the conflict in this part of the story is increasing. Usually the conflict is getting more and more evident, more and more high stakes. And as the conflict gets more and more evident, more and more high stakes, usually the conflict builds up to a point where something has to give, something has to turn or change. And that is called the climax of the story. It's the peak where you have the highest action usually. It's usually the most intense part of a story. The climax is the highest point of action of the story, but it's also a turning point. It's the point of the story where the conflict changes, typically for the better. Then the story moves into the next part, which is called the falling action. And this is the part of the story where the conflict sort of starts to wind down and decrease, and you sort of start to see things falling into place a little bit for the main characters. And that leads into the final part of the plot, which is the resolution. That's when the conflict is finally solved. Typically, whatever that struggle is resolved. There's an outcome. So that's the end of the story. So these are the 5 parts of plot. We're going to take a look at an example in a short film now. Okay, you've seen the exposition of this story. We should have met the characters, we should know what the setting is, and we should be able to describe what is the conflict of this story. Can you name those 3 things? All right, now we've seen the conflict of the story building and building. And each time that this pig tries something, right, it's a little bit more extreme and a little bit more extreme, and we're building up to a climax. Okay, the conflict has just changed. There was a turning point, and now the thing that the pig wanted has happened, but there's still a little bit more to happen. All right, so we saw all the parts of plot. By the way, at the end there, the falling action and resolution sort of all blended together, which often does happen in a story, and that's okay. Now, at the very end of this story, there was a resolution and then quickly followed by introducing a new problem for humor. the thing fell on top of his head. And a lot of times in a book, an author won't introduce a new problem right at the very end, but the movie makers in this case did that just to be funny. We saw now the 5 parts of plot. Hopefully that was a good review, and hopefully you understand now how plot can be like the engine of a story.